Hi, everyone. I'm from the Mental Health Law and Justice Association, and I'm really honored to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Liat Ben Moshe is an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. She works on such topics as deinstitutionalization and incarceration, prison abolition, disability, anti-capitalism and anarchism, and queerness and disability. She is co-editor of Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the United States and Canada, a collection of interdisciplinary scholarship examining the incarceration and segregation of people with disabilities in the United States and Canada. She holds a PhD in sociology with concentrations in gender studies and disability studies from Syracuse University.
Hello. Can people who usually hear me okay? All right, so I know we've been here for like 2 hours. I myself really have to pee. And so, feel free to roam around the room. It doesn't bother me at all. People who need to stretch, come in and out, whatever you need to be doing, it's absolutely cool. And, make yourself at home in this space. So what I want to talk to you about today is actually, first of all, I want to thank everybody that made this event possible, and I really want to thank all of you for coming and staying. Also, it's really remarkable to see a room so full on Friday night in New York. I don't live in New York, and I'm actually not from the US at all, but it's really great. I'm sure you all have like a lot of fab parties and stuff. I don't know what you all do in New York. So thank you for coming, and thank you for staying. And so it's really cruel to put me right after Miriam, I must say. But there's so many amazing people who spoke tonight, and I'm going to try to kind of connect some of the dots. And I'm going to do something tonight that I haven't done actually in a really long time. So I'm going to kind of take up the role of the disability advocate, quote unquote. And in my classes, I often kind of ask my student, do you, and I tell them, I don't always like see myself as a person with disability. I don't always even identify as a person with disability. And they're like, what? But I want to kind of give you a little bit of a primer about this, because I think one of the things we don't talk about is this idea of carceral ableism and what happens to people with disabilities in systems of incarceration, and especially in terms of understanding disability from a cultural perspective. So I'm going to try to give you kind of like a cultural competence of disability, ableism, and saneism in like 8 minutes. So obviously I'm going to fail, but I'm going to just try to have you maybe after this talk think about this a little more and maybe seek other things that will speak to this as well. And this is also why I don't do this kind of talk very often, because I don't like speaking for a group of people. Seems kind of, Okay, so people with disabilities are obviously very overrepresented in every aspect of criminalization and imprisonment. Incarceration itself doesn't really target or affect people equally. The majority of prisoners are poor, people of color. Poverty is known to cause a variety of impairments and of disabling conditions. And if you don't want to think too far, just think about Flint, for example. So that disability in prison or jail is seems more the rule than the exception. More than half of all prison and jail inmates were reported, and this is by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who underreports everything. More than half have been reported as quote-unquote mentally ill. In addition, the prison environment itself is very disabling, so even if you enter the prison without any kind of diagnosis of disability, you are likely to exit prison with the diagnosis. I think Abe was saying, obviously I had some issues in prison. I think these are the kind of issues and trauma that we don't often talk about. And we can think about that in relation to the SHU, for example, which is, much like what Miriam was just mentioning with TAMS, for example, the Supermax prison and other segregative facilities. But also we can think about it as just a disabling environment of the prison itself. But despite these very harsh realities that I just outlined in 20 seconds, Disability and ableism is very much missing from our analysis of incarceration and also of decarceration and abolition, which is pretty sad. When disability is present, it is conceived as a deficit, something in need of correction. And I'm using the word correction very specifically here. So we're kind of, this is exactly the idea of carceral ableism. So we need the correction by the correction industry and also by the medical industry, which are not very different from each other. But it's very, never almost looked as a nuanced identity. So for people, a lot of people with disabilities view their disability as a form of identity, and if they are connected to other people with disabilities who are politicized, they view it as a culture with a very rich history, which is exactly the history that Miriam was just mentioning. People with disabilities themselves are very, I would say, dangerously absent from the discussion of what to do on their behalf. So what should we do with the mentally ill in jail? What should we do with the mentally ill homeless? All these kind of questions. What should we do with intellectually disabled people? These are all questions that assume that people with disabilities don't have answers to these questions already. What to do with the population should never be a question, especially, you know, post-slavery. So especially when now many proposals for reform risks increasing surveillance over those who are already heavily impacted by imprisonment in the US. So I just want to mention quickly one such proposal, and this is the idea that you might have heard before. How many of you have heard, and these don't raise your hand if you came to my talk 2 weeks ago in New York. But how many of you have heard about the idea that prisons are now becoming prisons are now becoming the new asylums? Heard about it? All right. So a lot of people raised their hands. How many of you have heard that jails are now becoming the largest mental health facilities in the US? Mm-hmm. And so in much longer talks that I give, I kind of debunk every aspect of those two ideas. But just to give a very quick kind of overview of that, it basically is these ideas, instead of connecting activists in the institutionalization movement, which are movements that sought to abolish institutions such as psychiatric hospitals and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, instead of connecting prison abolition to those historical movements that can guide us towards abolition, we tend to scapegoat those movements for saying the institutionalization failed, people ended up in the streets, via being homeless, they ended up in jails, and jails are now the largest mental health facilities. None of that actually happened. Unfortunately, I'm a sociologist, so I deal with data, and you know, I'm a recovering sociologist. So, yes, we have other sociologists also on the panel. All right, so recovering. But you know, what social science and dealing with kind of data allowed me to do is to kind of see where the population is at and what's really happening as opposed to what we're saying is happening. And the larger question that came out for me as an activist is why? Why are we blaming social movements like deinstitutionalization for what's happening now? And you know, the other thing about jails being the largest mental health facility is, I mean, anybody that's been in a jail know how ridiculous that claim is. Nobody gets mental health care in a jail. It's not. So, I mean, just by calling something a mental health facility, it at least needs to provide mental health, and it really doesn't. And so I really think that we need to kind of debunk those. And I think that centering the disability in discussion of abolition can really help us do that. So one outcome of these policy appeals has been the really vocal critiques regarding mass incarceration for people with mental health issues. So people hear, oh my God, people mentally ill are so overly represented in prison and jails. Obviously, they don't need to be there. That's really problematic for abolition because that means somebody does need to be there. So I don't think that's a form of abolition, to just kind of erode the system for one population. Because like I said earlier, a lot of people that come in to the jail and prison come out with some kind of a trauma, as you would from violence by the state. And so I think that's really problematic. The other thing is with kind of reform instead of abolition-based approaches in regards to the connection between mental health and incarceration is that they tend to really increase the scope of incarceration. So this carceral ableism, or what James Kilgore called carceral humanism, is pushing us to do things like, oh, let's open more hospital beds in jail, right? Because jails are becoming the largest mental health facilities, so let's just make them mental health facilities. Let's just open more jails and prisons that deal with people with mental health issues, because right now they're not dealt with very well in these facilities. And of course, you can imagine that that's a not very abolitionary approach to incarceration or decarceration. The last thing I'll say about this is that the last proposal that I've heard is about chemical incarceration, what if my friend Eric Fabrice called chemical incarceration, and that's the idea that instead of relying on imprisonment, let's do things like electronic monitoring bracelet, or give people psychiatric drugs, or make them like less violent and all that. But people who are abolitionists know that really just increases the system and creates, instead of debunking an unjust system, just spreads an unjust system to more people unjustly. Okay, so if we think about disability not just as a medical condition needing correction, then we need to think about disability as a social movement. And one of the things that I've had really the privilege of engaging with in the last 15 years or so is to understand the deinstitutionalization movement, both historically and today, and deinstitutionalization in both mental health and intellectual disabilities. And it was really anti-psychiatry activists, people who were psychiatrized, and those fighting for the rights of people with intellectual disabilities that really helped to bring forth the largest decarceration move in US history, which is deinstitutionalization. So just like Miriam and other people have said, it's not hard, Abe, it's not hard to imagine abolition. Some of us already are living there. Some of us are living in a world without police and without the state. And historically, it's not hard to imagine, because the exact same arguments that are now being displayed against prison abolitionists have been displayed against deinstitutionalization. It's not realistic. It's utopian. What are we going to do with the people? What do you want, just open up like the doors and have crazy people like all over the streets? Blah, 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 blah. I mean, one-to-one, it's exactly the same arguments. And I think we have a lot to learn from people who fought that struggle since the mid-50s. People think deinstitutionalization has been around in the 70s. It started in 1955. And so there's a long history of that struggle, and we have a lot to learn from people who've been engaging with those movements. So lastly, and to conclude, because I know y'all are tired, what I want to say is that we really have undergone, this is based on analysis of a lot of people, including the amazing Angela Davis, we have undergone a process of de-skilling, essentially. So when we ask things like, okay, what are we going to do instead of calling the police, in our heads we go to places that are also carceral. And we go to places like, we need treatment for people with disability. And we need treatment for people who have addiction. And we need treatment for mental health. But what does treatment really mean to us is the question that I want to ask. And what does treatment mean in neoliberal times? What does treatment mean when we consider it an alternative to incarceration? Isn't rehabilitation or treatment another apparatus of the carceral state to make people in its own image, which is white, proletariat, heterosexual, masculine, able-bodied, sane, rational, and so on? So is it not, therefore, shouldn't we ask, in the context of the prison, and also in the disability context, what is the person being rehabilitated to? Basically being rehabilitated to a society that's already fraught with racism, violence, heteropatriarchy, settler colonialism. We didn't basically do anything by saying, people need treatment. So again, we undergone this process of de-skilling, by which if something happens to our neighbor, somebody's speaking loudly to somebody, we see somebody on the train that's, is obviously in a state of disengagement from reality, and we've gone through this process of we don't know what to do, we end up, calling the police, or we end up doing nothing, which sometimes is the better option, and sometimes it's always the better option from calling the police, but I'm saying the other options to do instead of doing nothing is what I'm saying. And so we need to reform these kind of relationships to each other. I think there's a lot that we can learn from disability movements and the psychiatry movements in regards to how to do that. And I want to say, two things to conclude with. One is, for those of you in the room that maybe are more attuned to disability movements and to psychiatry movements and so on, is that criminalization and incarceration are disability issues, and this is whether or not people actually identify as disabled. And so, if we think about Tanisha Anderson and other people who've been killed by police, I don't know that they identify necessarily as people who are mentally ill, people who are disabled, but I think that it's not means that in the movements that we build, the disability movements and otherwise, that we should not, we should exclude them based on that. That's ridiculous. But the other thing is that radical mental health and disability justice are abolition issues. And so unless we center the experience of people with disabilities, especially people who've been working politically for a really long time about these issues, I don't think we can talk about abolition. And I really encourage you to, if you haven't already, look at a statement by the Harriet Tubman Collective, which came out in relation to the Black Lives Matter platform. The Harriet Tubman Collective is made of people who are people of color, I think almost all black, who are disabled and have been for a really long time within disability justice and disability, other disability movements, who are really calling for centering their lived experiences within movements for social, racial, and criminal justice. Thank you.